Welcome to a comprehensive real estate video shooting tutorial. This is the first part of I think what will be a two-part series. The first one I'm going to be talking about all about the shooting and filming aspect of it, and the second part I'm going to be talking more about the editing and post-production work. I know there may be a lot of people who are already working in real estate photography and maybe looking at expanding their skill set into doing real estate videography. I think in this series that's something I really want to focus on. If you already have the equipment, how to use it and transition into the video scene. Alright, so the first section I'm going to talk about is setting up the house. Normally when I get to a house, the first thing I do is I will turn on all the lights and I'll go around and I'll turn on other assets in the house, such as like a fireplace, or if there's fans or other things that you want to highlight in a house. Just like these really dynamic features of a house that really add a whole bunch of depth to your video. As well, before beginning, I'll really try and talk to the real estate agent I'm working with and really ask them about the important details of the house, or if there's anything in particular that they really want to highlight. After I kind of have a good understanding and I've asked a few questions to really kind of get a clear idea so we're both on the same page, I'll go around and do one final check of the house before I start shooting. Usually for windows, what I'll do is I'll have the blinds all the way up to let the most amount of light in as possible. Some people like to put the windows down and kind of like turn the blinds so it's like kind of like half through, so it's not as harsh of light and it kind of diffuses a little bit. But I honestly just prefer to open it all the way to try and get as much light in as possible, because usually the biggest constraint I find with real estate videography is trying to get enough light in the shot. And just like having those windows all the way open, even though they'll probably be blown out, it really helps to light up the video. The biggest thing is to be consistent though, so if you open up the blinds in all the windows on the main floor, it's the best to do on all the other levels of the house as well, just to keep it consistent and really help with the flow of the video. Alright, now that you've got the house set up, it's time to start shooting. The camera that I use is the Sony a7 III, and then the lens that I almost always have on there is the Tamron 17-28 2.8. It's a great all-around lens for getting those wide shots as well as cropping in and getting those tight detail shots. It also has a pretty shallow depth of field, which really helps me highlight different accents of the house. For a full frame, I'd recommend anything from a 20mm to wider. And if you're using a crop sensor or an APS-C, I'd recommend around like a 14mm or wider if possible. Which is a big advantage of having a full frame camera, because you don't have to use as wide of a lens, and then in doing so you don't have to worry as much about a barrel distortion as you'd get in an ultra wide lens like a 14mm. That being said, there are some prime lenses out there that do pretty good without getting any distortion. But for me, again, I love using like this variable zoom lens that has some great wide potential as well as getting some really good close shots. As far as the settings I use when I'm shooting is I shoot everything in 60 frames per second. I'd say most cameras made within the last 5 or 10 years can do that, shoot at 60 frames per second. Usually in 1080p though, not 4K, and my camera being no exception. It can do 1080p at 60 frames per second, but it cannot do a 4K resolution at 60 frames per second, which is fine. I think 1080p is good enough for what you want to capture. But again, it's at 60 frames per second, and then I slow it down to 24 frames per second in post. For the aperture diameter, I keep it around 4 to 4.5. It seems to be like the sweet spot for allowing a lot to be in focus while still getting a lot of light in. And that's kind of like the battle throughout the house is trying to get enough light into your camera to illuminate this shot, which is why I tend to stay on the shallower side around 4.4 or 4.5. It's just important to keep attention to your focus and work around that. For shutter speed, I use 1/60, and I know that's controversial because the standard is the shutter speed should be double of the frames per second. But honestly, since I end up slowing down the footage anyways, I find that like the movement is still very fluid. It's not choppy like what you'd expect from using half of like the recommended shutter speed. And the big advantage is you get so much more light in than using double the shutter speed, and you can keep your ISO lower and keep the noise levels lower, and really I think gives a better final product. And that kind of brings me into like my ISO settings. I try to keep 1000 or under for the majority of the house. I find, especially for like the picture profile that I use, which I'll mention next, it really helps keep the noise levels lower while still giving me some good dynamic range. With that being said, sometimes in basements you can't help but crank it up to 1500, sometimes as high as 2500. I mean, there's not really a whole lot you can do in those situations. I mean, it's not like you're gonna like bring a whole bunch of like studio lights to just light a basement. So just do what you can with that. I mean, you can even try opening up the aperture a little bit more if it's a smaller basement, but really you're kind of stuck in what you can do, and sometimes the only option is to crank up the ISO, and your hands are kind of tied in that situation. For for picture profile, I find a log hybrid seems to work the best. A lot of people like to shoot in full log. I'm not a big fan. The biggest thing being is it requires so much light to get like a good product from it. Especially with like the Sony S-Log2, you usually want to overexpose it by 2 stops at least to get a good product when you compress it in post. The reason people like to use log, I guess, is because you get like that high dynamic range, but it just has such a high light requirement that I rarely use a full log picture profile for real estate. Instead, I like to use a hybrid. For Sony, it's called HLG2, I think is the best log gamut for real estate. I'm not too familiar with Canon or Nikon or other ones, but I think if you looked online quickly, similar picture profiles to HLG2 for Canon or Nikon or whatever you use, I'm sure there'll be lots of resources out there to help with that. If there is no good, or you don't want to bother with color grading or too much of that, you can just shoot flat in like the base picture profile if you want, but I use HLG2 for all of my videos. I keep it on autofocus for the whole time just because, especially when you're using a gimbal, it's a lot to kind of like finick with like the autofocus as you move through. I find cameras nowadays have such an amazing autofocus anyways that you don't really need to use manual focus, except maybe on like some detail shots. But for the most part, I'll just leave it on autofocus all the way through the house. For white balance, I will also leave that on auto. I know for my camera, the A7 III, it works pretty good. And honestly, I find for the amount of time it takes to kind of like correct the white balance in every room, compared to like how quick it is to fix in post-production, I find it's just easier to use like the eyedropper tool in Adobe Premiere, correct the white balance there, than have to play with it on the camera on the house, because then you spend less time in the house, you're more efficient with your time, and you can focus on really just like getting the important shots you need in the house rather than trying to really nail the white balance. So besides my camera when I'm filming the house, I use my gimbal. I currently have the Zhiyun Crane 1. It's a pretty old crane, but it still works great with my full frame Sony camera. Some people use fly cams for real estate. I really think it's advantageous to spend like the extra $100 or whatever it is to get like a gimbal. You can get like a Zhiyun Crane 1 or 2 or what's the other one, Weeble. You can get them for pretty cheap on eBay or Amazon. I've seen them used for like a couple $100s. I think it's really worth the investment, and it just really helps deliver like a lot smoother of a product and gives you a lot more flexibility with what you can do. So once you have your camera all balanced on your gimbal, it's time to start shooting. When you're shooting the inside of the house, try and keep it at around a 5'4", 5'5" height. For me, that's like right around chest level. It's a really nice height for showing off the house. It kind of makes everything feel a bit bigger and grand and open, and I just find it's the best height to shoot at when filming any house. The next most important thing to do while you're shooting is to make sure everything is level. On my Sony camera, there is an option on the display menu, so I can always have a level on to see if my levels are tilted to the right or left or up and down. For the majority of my shots, I try to keep things level and straight, just to keep the lines of the house looking nice and regular without seeming distorted, like when you point your camera up or down or side to side. Next thing for shooting is the lighting for each room and how to set it on your camera. It's really important to focus on exposing the shadows correctly more than it is exposing the highlights correctly. And by that, I mean it's really important to, capture like the brightness of the room, so like the walls, the furniture, and just like the general space, more than it is to kind of like worry about the windows, because 90% of the time the windows are going to be blown out. There's nothing you can really do about that. It's kind of like a part of video. It's not really like the luxury you have with photos where you can kind of like do like an HDR image and properly expose the shadows and the highlights. With video, it's kind of like why we shoot in a log or log hybrid. It gives us a bit more flexibility with that, but for the most part, your windows are going to be blown out. Just focus on making the room nice and bright itself. So again, the only thing that you're really changing in each room, if you're using the same settings as I am, is either the ISO or the aperture diameters. I'll usually start actually filming the exterior. For the exterior, I'll try to get at least 3 to 4 shots from different angles, showing off the house. I find like the best angle if you're going from the side is the side that shows the front entrance as well to the rest of the house. So if you're looking at it from the corner, it's the corner with the entrance, maybe the driveway, depending on how the front of the house looks. That's always a solid shot, kind of moving on a rotation, either left or right. As well, you can get a straight on shot going towards it, and maybe even a close-up shot walking up to the front door. If you get the wide shot from the front of the house walking up to the front door, there's something really cool we can do with that in editing, which I'll explain in the second part. But again, it's always better to get more than less shots. So if you're outside anyways, try and get as many different angles as you can. Play with it, play around with it, get some different movement. It'll just you'll thank yourself in editing having more than less footage, especially if you're just starting out in this and learning. It'll really help you grow and find out what works a lot faster. Another thing you can use for your outdoor shots is an ND filter. It really helps you maintain the same shutter speed. As well, it kind of keeps the highlights under control and just kind of helps deliver a bit more color and dynamic range in your outdoor shots. If you don't have one, I don't think it's completely necessary, but it is something that I do use for all of my real estate videos. Alright, so moving on to the interior of the house. Again, you want to keep things at around a 5'5" level when you're shooting, as well keep things nice and straight. And the next biggest thing is to really slow down. Especially when you're starting, it can be really tempting to kind of like walk a bit too fast through the house and like kind of like walk through the doorway or at a bit too fast of a pace. It's really important to kind of like take your time with the shots, even though we're slowing it down to about 40% from 60 frames per second to 24. It's just so much more important to just like really slow down through the shots. They give you so much more flexibility with pacing. You can always speed it up if you need to, but if you can't slow it down beyond 40%, you're kind of hooped. So take your time, slow down, and step very smoothly. Use your knees as kind of a shock absorber as you're walking with the gimbal. Even though the gimbal stabilizes it, it doesn't do a perfect job most of the time. So the rest of it is up to you. And it kind of takes a bit of practice to kind of like get the stealthy ninja walk where you don't move up and down too much between your steps. It's just about really focusing on your feet as you take your steps and just absorbing the up and down motion with your knees to keep things nice and level and not bouncy. As far as movement goes, your best bet is always just to go straight forward. It's a really nice, natural, fluid motion of going through the house. You know, not to say that like going at a rotation or going up or down, you know, things like that can really have like their time and place. But especially if you're just learning and you want to be a bit safer about delivering a good product, just always keep your motion moving forward through the rooms and you'll be just fine. The one movement to avoid, which I've said in a past video, is don't pan. Panning is very tempting to do, you know, especially if you're in a box and you want to show all the space in it. A natural thing to do is just pick up your camera and move all the way around, right? But it's very cheesy, it's cheap, it looks not professional and kind of amateur in my opinion. And I just really try to stay away from pans as much as I can. You know, not to say that you can't like add a bit of tilt or whatever like into your forward motion. So if you're going forward and you want to like pan a little bit, that's fine. But if you're just standing in one place and panning, that's when it's a problem. I think like, I don't know, I think like HGTV does it a lot, but it just gives us like very like corny and kind of unpolished look. So just don't pan. And also when you're filming, don't be afraid to show the doorway. It actually kind of gives this feeling of somebody going into a room anyways. So if you have to start outside of a room and walk through the doorway to get to the room, that's totally fine. But because you have it on autofocus, it may be a bit wonky going through, like it may be focused on the frame and then focus into the room. So a good way to get around this is just to film in reverse. So start in the room and then kind of back out through the doorway. And then when you edit it, you can reverse it and it'll look very nice. When you're moving from room to room, or if you're transitioning from wide shots to close-up shots, really try and keep in mind like what the movement was of the last shot you just did. So if you know going into the kitchen, you kind of did like an arc into the kitchen moving forward, and then you kind of want to highlight maybe this like gas stove top. So keep the same left to right movement going into the kitchen, and then go again, start at the gas stove top on the left side to the right side, and it just will really help the flow and pacing of the video, and it'll just give like this really nice polish on top of everything you're already doing. A really important thing to keep in mind when you're starting out is to really capture each room from multiple angles. I mean, you kind of know like what does work and what are good base shots to have, you know, just like a wide shot of each room going in. But sometimes you can surprise yourself from like different angles in the room. Editing you will thank filming you for filming more. Beside getting all of the wide shots, it's also really important to get the detail shots. I think this is a thing that a lot of like real estate videographers omit from their videos or don't really take the time to capture. And I think it's a shame because I think it's the best part of real estate videography is having this opportunity to highlight different parts of the property you're filming. You know, especially with the photography where like detail shots don't really fit into the listing when you have a limited amount of photos to use. In real estate videography, you have the opportunity to really like twist the viewer's arm into telling them what makes this house special. You know, along with like the music, you can use these like different kind of like detail shots to really quickly like jump in and say, hey, look at this really cool gas stovetop, look at this backsplash, look at this amazing fireplace. And it just really helps like show off the home and adds like this artistic flair to real estate videography, which I think is a big reason, in my opinion, why real estate videography is essential if you want to make a listing stand out. It's totally different than a virtual tour or photography. Videography, it just like it's an experience for the viewer, right? Like they don't have to walk through the house like they would have to in a virtual tour. Like they don't have to work through it. They don't have to scroll through the photos. All they have to do is press play and then let the videographer tell them, oh, what this house is about. And that's the coolest thing about having this job. You know, it's like you really get to like bring the lifestyle you're trying to sell of this house to life. Like you get to create these visualizable moments in the house of like where maybe the potential buyer could see themselves in the house. Anyways, so like I was saying, detail shots. They're super important. It's another nice reason why I like having the Tamron 17-28, because if I really want to get like a close, maybe a bit more compressed shot from farther away, I can jump into 28, I can crop into APS-C if I want to, which will bring me around 40 millimeters or something like that, which is more than enough. If you have prime lenses, you can always like maybe do all the wide shots first, come back, put the closer lens on, and then just kind of film those detail shots and rebalance it on your gimbal. For me, it's just so convenient having this lens because it's internally balanced in the zoom, and it does everything I need to do. So obviously you kind of like want to usually open the aperture as wide as it'll go, and then you get to have a lot of fun with it. You know, it's like you get to kind of like be an artist. You can really think about creative ways to highlight different architectural accents of the house. You know, there's no really right or wrong way of doing it. One thing I will say though is foreground is your friend. I find having like that reveal shot from maybe like behind a counter or behind a wall to kind of like showing maybe like the breakfast bar or something like that. Or if you kind of like go from left to right to reveal this like fireplace or something like that. Again, those are kind of shots that you can film in reverse. So maybe like you're already on the breakfast bar and then you can move behind a wall and then kind of see how that looks. Just kind of like really like take your time, like look around, like how can I get some cool shots here, right? All right, and then the third type of shots I want to talk about are the long connecting shots. So, you know, with open concept becoming more and more popular and I think like a staple in like new constructions, a really nice shot that you can use is a moving shot all the way through the house from front to back. So with these, it's again really, really important to try and keep it as smooth as possible, do it as slow as possible. Even though you're gonna speed remap it in post, do it as smoothly as possible. You know, it'll just give the best final product. But so maybe at the front of the house is the living room, so you start there, moving forward, and then you turn, walk through the kitchen, kind of like try and get like a nice straight shot through there, and then keep walking through, and maybe at the end there's like a bonus room or something like that. Those are 3 shots which you can speed remap to kind of like show how the house is connected and how like the dynamics of it work. Again, it's nicer than just using 3 shots kind of chopped together because it kind of shows the flow of the house. Once you've captured everything, it's important to do one final walkthrough to make sure you've got everything. Sometimes like doing a shot later on in the house can inspire you to do a different shot, maybe like an earlier part of the house. So just kind of like really think about like things you have shot and how they might work together, and if there's anything else you want to get. Because again, it's better to have more than less, and editing you will thank filming you for making sure you have all the shots. Alright, I think that's it for part 1. Again, part 2 is going to be all the post-production work, so it's going to be the editing and what to do with the footage and what that looks like. If you have any questions for this video, please let me know down below. I will genuinely try to answer them all. But thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. I really do appreciate it, and until next time.